So I had never watched the 2010 NASCAR Sprint Cup Series season in its entirety. 2011 was my first full-time season of watching NASCAR. 2010 was when I watched my first race. The first one I can ever remember watching, even a part of, was the 2010 Daytona 500. There were some races later that season that I remember bits and pieces of. Um, I went to the second Pocono race of 2010, the one where Elliott Sadler had his terrible crash. Um, and the first race I can really remember from start to finish from that time frame was the 2010 AMP Energy Juice 500 at Talladega, the Talladega Chase race that happened on Halloween that year. That is the first race I can remember from start to finish from that time period of watching the start and watching the finish. I remember some other races, bits and pieces in between the 500 and that Talladega race, but really I knew not much about 2010. Just all of the highlights, as you will, like obviously McMurray winning the 500, Edwards sending Keselowski flying through the air at Atlanta, Jimmie winning a championship, Denny kind of giving it away at points at Homestead and Phoenix with his issues there, the Gordon and Burton stuff at Texas. So yeah, there was stuff I knew about it, but that was only the major stuff. I didn't know any little, intricacies of this 2010 season until now. I decided to go and watch all 35 races that are available. Someone really needs to upload the Martinsville Chase race from that year, and then I can really say I've watched all of 2010. But somehow, some way, that 2010 Martinsville Chase race is not on YouTube in its entirety. There is a race in 60 segment, but it's not the full race, so it doesn't really count. You can't really watch that and be like, yeah, I know everything that happened in the race. So yeah, if someone could upload that, that'd be great. That's really the only 2010 race that's missing. Besides the ones that are in bad quality, like the Coke Zero 400 or the Bristol Night Race or the Dover Chase race. But you could let the bad quality slide as long as it's on YouTube. We just need some form of the 2010 Martinsville Chase race in its entirety. But so I watched 2010, didn't go into it knowing what to expect, right? And that's really good because when I did this watch through from 2011 to 2019, I went to each season not knowing what to expect, but kind of remembering stuff that I had thought from the seasons, right? I even had like my own ranking before then of like I think 2011 was the best, and 2012, then this one, then this one, then this one, all the way down to where I thought 2015 was the worst. And while the ranking came out a little bit different, I almost want to feel like it influenced it a little bit. Um, Not too much though, because I feel like it's actually pretty consistent. The rankings were like they kind of all fell around an average area. But it was nice to go into 2010 not really knowing what to expect, because as I mentioned, the only full race I can remember from 2010 ever watching in full was the Talladega Chase race, and that was literally on October 31st, 2010 when I watched it in full. So I had not watched a full 2010 race before this year since 2010. So I thought it was perfect for me. So I went and set out on this quest and watched the 35 races available on YouTube of 2010. And after watching all of these races, I have to say that 2010 is maybe one of the most underrated NASCAR seasons in recent memory. I would say definitely maybe the most underrated NASCAR season of the 2010s and one of the most underrated in the 21st century. It literally had everything a race fan needs and wants, and I mean, it doesn't get talked enough about. The good racing at basically every track type. Um, it had short runs, long runs at races. It didn't really overdo it with stuff like that, and it had a really good championship battle, which also I don't feel like it's talked about enough. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But so whenever I watch all the races, I give them a rating from 1 to 100. Very rarely does it go down. I don't think it's ever gone down below a 20. And the highest I've given a race was a 99. That was the 2011 Homestead race. Um, But when I average all the races together for 2010, the average race rating came out to be a 72.4, which whenever I compare it to 2011 to 2019, it's actually the second best behind 2011. It beat out 2014, 2013, 2016, 2012. So, yeah, 2010 was really, really good. And just watching the races was like a breath of fresh air. Um, and I'll talk more about specific races. For example, I want to start with the 500 because it was a super speedway type race that I don't think I've ever really watched that much of. In terms of the pack actually got split up on longer runs because the track was so bumpy back then. It was the year before they repaved it for the 2011 500. So the track was really bumpy. Handling came into play so much that the pack would get spread out, and people were pulling away by like a second or two, right? And it was different, but it was actually kind of fun because people could still make passes, right? The cars back then, they kind of drafted so well that you could slingshot past them when you didn't really need help to do it at points. You just needed a good enough car at that point to make it happen. So that was interesting to see for both the 500 and the Coke Zero 400. It was also interesting to see they started the season with the wing, and then they changed it to the spoiler a few races in. That was always kind of interesting to me, too. I never realized that once they switched to the spoiler, they stayed like that. For some reason, there was always a part of me that thought that when they went to the spoiler, they alternated back to the wing for some races. But no, when they went to the spoiler a few races in, they pretty much stayed there for the rest of the season, which I think was really cool. That they actually listened to drivers and fans on something like that, because I don't think anyone really liked the wing. It looked stupid, and I mean, I don't think it hurt the racing, right? The wing didn't really hurt unless you were looking for drafting style. Then it kind of didn't create as much of a hole in the air, but it didn't create as much dirty air as well. So I guess that was a positive of it. But going into specific races and specific trends of the season. First of all, kind of forgot about how terrible the debris cautions were around this time period, of just being like, oh, there's debris on the track, put it out, even though there probably wasn't debris on the racetrack. There were some instances where there was debris and it was, a logical caution, but there were many times debris came out. It's like, it's definitely because they just ran, 75 laps without a caution. They needed a yellow. So that was definitely annoying at points, but that did not stop from long green flag runs happening. There was one race that ESPN was broadcasting. It was either the Dover Chase race or the Kansas race. ESPN was broadcasting it, and they put in a little fact about the races that they've been broadcasting, and they said something like the last 4 or 5 races had green flag runs of 100 laps or more, right? And I was like, wow, that's crazy. And I actually just went back and looked because I wanted to see what it was like. And yes, there were 6 races in a row in ESPN's segment that had green flag runs of 100 laps or more. Bristol night race, the Atlanta race, Richmond, Loudon, Dover, and Kansas all had green flag runs at least 100 laps long, right? 14 of the 36 races had green flag runs of 100 laps or more. How does that compare to something like 2022? Well, in 2022, only 4 of the 36 races had green flag runs of 100 laps or more. And those 4 happened at 2 racetracks. So yes, 2 racetracks that had 2 races had those green flag runs. They were Martinsville and Richmond. Both those races in 2022 had the long green flag runs. There were some tracks that came close, like the finale at Phoenix came close. Homestead came kind of close. Kansas came really close. The whole final stage went caution-free. Loudon came close, but, I mean, it doesn't even compare, right? Even if we add in those 3 or 4 races, you're still only up to 8. That's still 6 less than what 2010 saw. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, whenever I go to racing, I want to watch green flag racing. I don't want to watch caution flag stuff, and I want to see green flag runs where you get a green flag pit cycle in, a full green flag pit cycle in, everyone cycles out, see who can manage the tires, see who can, try and stay on the lead lap throughout the green flag run. It's just something fun to watch, and it just doesn't really happen anymore with the advent of stages. but it just used to be so fun. I'm sure for like a casual fan, it's probably not fun to watch green flag racing, but for me, it's just something to go and be like, oh, look at this. Here comes this person's starting to like they gain on the long run. This person's really moving forward because the green flag runs can really show that, right? With the restarts and stuff, you don't really get to know who's good in the long run because it's all about restarts, and you can easily gain 3 or 4 positions on a restart or lose 3 or 4 positions on a restart. Long green flag runs, you kind of know who has a good car and who doesn't. And it's unfortunate they don't happen as much anymore. They don't really happen at all on intermediate tracks anymore with the advent of stages, which is unfortunate. We didn't really see many green flag pit cycles in 2022, but let me tell you, 2010 that got me the green flag pit cycles I was craving. So that was cool. And one of the races that stood out really, really well to me was actually my favorite race of 2010 in terms of ranking, the Atlanta race, the second Atlanta race. So everyone, when they talk about Atlanta around that time period, they talk about the 2011 race, and for good reason, because it was a really good race and it had a really good finish. An Atlanta race that immediately gets kind of thrown under the rug because the 2011 one was so good was the 2010 second race, which was a really, 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 really good race. But 2011 just kind of overshadowed it because it was that much better. 2010 was still very, very good. It went 133 laps green to start, and Denny and Tony battled for the lead basically all 133 of those laps. And then even after that, the racing was spectacular. At one point, there was a three-way battle for the lead between Carl Edwards, Jimmie Johnson, and Kasey Kahne, and the three of them were using different lanes. Carl was all the way at the top, Jimmie was in the middle, Kasey was at the bottom. It was great racing, and there were many battles like that during the race that were amazing. Other, races that were really good that season. Both the Fontana races were fun. Homestead was always normally a good one. That was really fun as well. The first Atlanta race was fun. Darlington was pretty fun. The Coke 600 was fun. The first Texas race was really good. The second Michigan race was probably the best Michigan race I've ever watched. The first Loudon race was excellent. Kansas had some really good moments during it. So, I mean, there were races during 2010 where I was like, it's just spectacular to see what they were focusing on at points during the broadcast and just how good some of the racing was, and it doesn't really get talked about. 2010, just like when people talk about good seasons and good championship battles and whatnot, people will go like, oh, 2011, 2014, 2016, but it's just kind of the COT era gets thrown away as if it didn't happen or as if it wasn't good when people just kind of have a bad taste of it because the cars didn't look good, right? The cars were bricks. They looked ugly. They weren't appealing, but they raced pretty darn well. And, I mean, when you look at it, the Xfinity cars now use the COT chassis, right? So we know the car's good. It's just they looked pretty ugly, right? If they looked better and weren't aero monsters like the Gen 6 or this next-gen car, it would probably be some of the best racing we've ever seen in NASCAR. Unfortunately, the Gen 4s were just liked better because they kind of looked meaner. They looked more like stock cars, whereas the COTs were just kind of bricks on the racetrack, which was unfortunate, but that's kind of how it happened. So yeah, 2010 was fun from racing wise. 2010 was also fun from parity wise, right? NASCAR's big thing lately has been getting parity back up among teams, so they went to spec cars, right? Basically, everyone gets the same stuff. So that no one can really gain an advantage. Well, back in 2010, everyone was still making their own stuff, and there were so many teams and drivers that had chances to get to the front. It was insane. You obviously had the powerhouses of Hendrick and Gibbs, Roush and RCR at the point that were doing well. Penske was doing well. Stewart-Haas was doing well. But then you had some of the middle of the pack teams. I'm sure I'm missing some teams, but just off the top of my head, Chip Ganassi had both cars running well. Richard Petty Motorsports had at times 3 cars that could contend for top 10s. JTG Doherty had at points, top 15, top 10 runs. Red Bull Racing sometimes showed up with speed out of nowhere. So, I mean, there were a lot of cars that could show up on any given Sunday during that season and show up and compete for top 5s and top 10s that there were probably over 20 cars that I would, go into a race and be like, all right, I wonder which of these, 20 to 25 cars are going to show up and go for the top 10 or top 5. And it really kind of just, it made the season interesting as a whole because you never knew what you were going to get. Was it going to be, obviously there were 200 cars that were really good throughout the whole season. A third one was good for a good point of the season. There was a fourth one, Dale Jr., that was good for a handful of races, but then, so you had at least 200 cars there. All three RCR cars were running well. The Joe Gibbs cars had all three kind of run pretty well. Stuart Haas had 2 cars run well. That's already 10 cars right there. Roush had Roush had 3 cars run pretty well during the season. Richard Petty Motorsports, as I mentioned, normally it was about 2 cars, AJ Allmendinger and Casey Kane, that were running well. And I mean, the list just keeps going on and on and on. Both the Chip Ganassi cars ran well, so I mean, it was just so competitive with teams building their own stuff. That's what was fun about it, is that, the teams built their own thing. They brought their own stuff to the racetrack, and they were still very competitive with each other. That's just fun. And then, to cap the season off, the championship battle has to be one of the most underrated championship battles in NASCAR history. And the only reason I can think of it that way is because 2011 happened the season after it. If 2011 did not happen, I still think 2010 goes down as one of the best championship battles in NASCAR Cup Series history. Because it put 3 guys against each other, right? 3 that had a shot into Homestead, a legitimate shot going into Homestead. Jimmie Johnson, Kevin Harvick, and Denny Hamlin all had a legitimate shot. While it looked like it was going to be between Johnson and Denny because they were separated by just 15 points, Kevin was there. If Jimmie and Denny both finished back half of the top 10 and Kevin won the race, Kevin would have been the champion, right? Because of the point system back then. And it was really funny because at one point in Homestead, right, Jimmie had a bad pit stop. Denny was starting to move back up after his spin and his damage he got there. So they were both back around 10th place or so. Kevin Harvick was up in like 2nd or 3rd place because his pit crew was doing wonderful that race. And all 3 of them were within 10 points of the championship. 10 points, right? I mean, and back in that system, 10 points was nothing, right? That was where the top 6 or 7 had 5 points between them. So, I mean, you could have easily made up 7 points with 2 positions, right? At worst, 3 positions, because it went from 5 points per position to 4 to 3, right? It was kind of a staggered system. So the points were a lot easier to come by back then. And, I mean, even watching Homestead, knowing that Jimmie Johnson was going to win his 5th straight championship, watching it, I was like, oh my God, I never knew what happened during this race, right? The only thing I knew was that Denny spun, right? That's the only thing I knew during it. And I didn't know how early that happened. I thought that was a later race thing. I didn't realize that happened on like lap 22 or 24, something around there, which was very interesting to say the least. But yeah, after that, I was like, oh, well, I guess the championship battle's not that fun. I guess Danny's just going to, stay in the back all race and not really do anything. Jimmie will run up at the front. But that's not what happened at all. Jimmie had control for a lot of the first half. Denny slowly started making his way back up. Kevin started slowly making his way up. Jimmie's car fell off. Kevin passed him. Kevin's going up there and racing up inside the top 5 with one of the fastest cars on the track. Jimmie then falls back to Denny and falls actually behind Denny at one point. Kevin's up there, and on one of the final pit stops, Kevin goes up there and actually grabs the lead on a yellow flag pit stop, but then was caught speeding on pit road. I can only imagine what would have happened if Kevin was not caught speeding, if he could have had a shot at the championship, a lot better shot at the championship than what he had then. Because even after speeding on pit road, he came back with some strategy and got himself back up in it in case something happened to Jimmie and Denny. So it was very close all throughout, and I mean, the whole chase was pretty close. At one point it looked like Jimmie was going to run away with it, and then Denny towards the end of the chase looked like he was going to run away, but his Phoenix mishap on fuel and then his Homestead spin brought Jimmie right back into it. Jimmie ended up winning, but I mean, people don't talk about 2010 championship, which made me think, oh, Jimmie just kind of walked away with it. I knew Denny was leading into the final race, but once again, I thought that maybe he was just a non-factor the whole race, but that's not what happened at all. Jimmie was actually, at a point, it looked like Jimmie was not going to win the championship because he started fading behind Denny by a few positions, and Denny had the points lead coming in, so he started to open up his gap. I was like, wow, I don't know how Jimmie ends up winning this, but he did end up winning it. So, I mean, it was just a really fun season overall. If you're looking for some races to watch during this off season, because I'm sure people don't just go watch 2010 races out of nowhere, right? Some of the races I'd recommend, definitely that 2010 Atlanta race, the second Atlanta race, was one of the best races I've ever watched. All four Super Speedway races were fun this season. The Chase race at Fontana was fun. Martinsville in the spring was really fun. Homestead was fun to watch. Fontana again. The first Fontana race, the first Atlanta race was fun. The Coke 600 was a fun watch. The first Texas race was a fun watch. If you want to watch, when Michigan was fun and, very wide group racetrack, that second Michigan race was outstanding. I'd say probably the best Michigan race I've ever watched, which is saying something. The first Loudon race was really fun because there were comers and goers throughout the long green flag runs, and then those final battles between Jimmie and Kurt were outstanding. Yeah, that's just kind of how I feel about 2010. I mean, an outstanding race, and it kind of furthers my evaluation that the COT is overhated and underappreciated. Um, yeah, like I mentioned before, people have a bad taste in it because it came right after the Gen 4 and it looked terrible and it started with the wing. But I think when you take the wing off, the car, even with the wing, was pretty good racing wise because it was good at the beginning of 2010. I can't see how it was terrible in at least 2009. Maybe 2008 because it was a new car, but in 2009, which I'm probably going to watch next because I want to see how it went. Um, I can't imagine it was bad. 2009. If the beginning of 2010 was that good, even with the wing on the car, 2009 can't be that bad. So I'm gonna go probably watch 2009 at some point whenever I have free time, and see how that went. Review all the races, and because all 36 are actually on YouTube. And please, someone upload the 2010 Martinsville Chase race so I could be like, I've watched all the races in 2010, and not be like, when is someone gonna upload it? And why did NASCAR even stop uploading the classic race replays, right? They should have had this one uploaded by now. But they don't. And no one does. But it's fine. Someone should do it at some point. But yeah, I kind of rambled on a little bit, but that's about it. 2010. If you want to watch races from it, you should do it, right? I listed some there. And really, you can't go wrong with too many. The only ones I really were kind of like meh about were the Dover Chase race was probably according to me, was the worst race of the season. The first Michigan race was pretty bad. Indianapolis was bad. Both Richmonds were eh. Both Poconos were pretty eh as well. If you want to watch something from Pocono, just go to the middle part of the second Pocono race because it gets really interesting because rain is near, so people are racing very aggressively. Um, the Charlotte night race wasn't all that great. Chicagoland I thought was going to be better because Rudeman won. It wasn't really all that good. Dover, again, the first Dover race wasn't all that good. Vegas was pretty bad. The first Phoenix race wasn't that great. Even Watkins Glen wasn't that great. But, yeah, it had, in my opinion, 6 great races. Those 6 great races were the second Atlanta race, both Talladegas, the 500, the second Fontana race, and the first Martinsville race. And who knows, maybe the second Martinsville race would also be considered a great race. But, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely looking forward to watching 2009 to see how it goes, and maybe if 2009 doesn't go as I thought it would, maybe I'll start trekking into a Gen 4 season because I've never actually watched a full Gen 4 season. I've watched very minimal full Gen 4 races as it is, so that would be fun to watch and see how it goes. Maybe something like 02 or 04. I know 02 is probably one of the best seasons of the 2000s in terms of like full season points format. So that would be fun to watch. 04 was the first season of the Chase and was absolutely outstanding that season from what I've heard. 05 was pretty good as well. So I would think maybe 02 because that was kind of before the whole debris caution stuff. The mid to late 2000s and the early 2010s was the height of debris cautions up until like 2015, 2016. And then stages came along. They were like, we don't need to throw debris cautions anymore because we've put 2 in during every race anyway. So, yeah. That's about it. Thanks for watching this whole thing if you did. Yeah, COTs for life. Let's go with that. at this point, COTs, I think, only trail Gen 4s in terms of like best NASCAR stock car. I for sure put it ahead of the Gen 6. The Gen 6 is a terrible race car. Um, and the next gen I'm still iffy on because of some of the, it's like a sports car now. Doesn't really have the benefits of a stock car. So, yeah, I'm gonna go watch 2009, and maybe I'll report back on that in like a few months or something. Hopefully before the 2023 500, maybe I can just go the off season watching 2009 and get out of the way because I was looking, and a lot of the races are actually pretty short, so it should be a pretty quick watch. But now I'm actually done. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys for the next one.